Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. Just give us a few seconds here. Sorry for the delay. We'll get started in a second, okay? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Andres, program coordinator for NAMMBA. I would like to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to today's session. First off, I would like to give a special thanks to our Diamond Plus sponsors and partners at Class Valuation for their support and also for hosting this webinar. I would also like to remind everyone about our Connect tours coming up this spring. We are very excited and we hope you can join us. Please keep in mind registration will be opening really soon on NAMMBA.org, so please be on the lookout for that. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming our moderator for today, Faith Schwartz with Housing Finance Strategies. Thank you, Faith, so much for being here today, and thank you to all you guys. I'll just go ahead and turn my camera off and hand things over to you, Faith.
Okay, well, thanks so much. And thank you to NAMMBA for all the work you do in our industry. And boy, I'm excited to be with this group today. It's an esteemed group who's really well-versed in appraisal valuations and biases in the system. And I think we're going to have a really interesting exchange. Today, what I'll do is I'll introduce each panelist. I'll give you a little bit of background on each, and then I'll start with Melody Taylor, who will kick us off and is leading the PAVE initiative. So briefly, Melody Taylor is a regional director for the Mid-Atlantic Office of the Fair Housing for HUD, and she long ago worked for the National Fair Housing Alliance, where Nikita is working right now, early in her career. And it's really quite a pleasure to be introducing Melody today because of her very significant role. She's leading the government PAVE initiative, which you'll hear about very shortly. Nikita Bailey, she's the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for the National Fair Housing Alliance and was formerly the EVP of the Center for Responsible Lending. Nikita is well known in Washington circles and across the country really for her civil rights efforts in fair lending and consumer protections. Today we also have Alan Hummel with us, and I'm real excited to have Alan here today because if you want to know anything and everything about appraisals and about the appraiser function, Alan is the one to speak to. Some say it's in his blood. His father was an appraiser, so he really grew up in the business. I'm looking forward to hearing from Alan and some of his thoughts on where things are going. And most recently, Alan was the chief appraiser for First American. Last but not least, we have Scott Rose. Scott is the Chief Innovation Officer for Class Valuation. If it's not the #1 AMC in the market, it's one of the top AMCs, top 3. And he is very uniquely situated because he also has been an appraiser, but he's also leading the tech revolution and how to offer more tools and different thinking and how we can provide the valuation profession and the industry more tools at their disposal to work with in the valuation system. So we're going to have fun today hearing from all of you. So Melody, let's get started with you. First of all, it is not easy. I believe the PAVE initiative is over 17 government agencies pulling together actions around valuation, potential bias in the system. And I'd love to hear from you about the current state of this effort, but also, you know, what you're learning along the way. Thank you. Melody.
Thank you for having me. On behalf of Secretary Fudge and the HUD leadership, I want to thank NAMMBA and its members for holding today's conversation on modernization and valuation. Excited to talk to you about PAVE as well. We're in a pivotal time in which technology and innovations implemented with equity in mind can narrow the wealth gap for all, especially in communities of color. And that is part of what PAVE is considering, among other things. So earlier this year, President Biden called on federal agencies, which together ensure more than 70% of the nation's mortgage market, take a whole of government approach to rooting out discrimination and advancing equity in the appraisal process, which resulted in PAVE. And you know, in the government, we use lots of acronyms. PAVE actually stands for Property Appraisal Evaluation Equity. And it is a task force, as Faith mentioned. There are over 15 federal and independent agencies from across federal government that are operating, collaborating, and innovating to bring about change to this industry. The task force is led none other than by our Secretary, Marcia Fudge, but also we're working in tandem with the Domestic Policy Council, Ambassador Susan Rice, and her team are also working on this as well. So very important issue that we're embarking upon. So prior to the president's announcement in July on the formation of PAVE and looking into appraisal bias and discrimination in the home buying process, we know that it remains a longstanding civil rights issue and concern. Redlined and marginalized communities that have suffered from disinvestment to blighted neighborhoods and homes that couldn't receive adequate homeowners insurance are all facets of what this task force is considering as some of the contributing factors relating to appraisal bias. The president's foresight to mandate this initiative was what we believe to be very timely and stimulated a call to action from the industry and advocacy alike. PAVE is also about people in our communities who are doing all the right things. So this is a consumer facing and an industry facing initiative. We want to help those folks who are, again, doing the right things, who are putting a down payment, they're buying, to buy a home, that are volunteering at places and working with nonprofit agencies to help their communities. We want to make sure that they get good information, that they understand their rights. And I think in general, what we can all agree upon is that the discrimination and appraisal bias is an unacceptable and a long-standing systemic issue that has essentially invaded communities of color from around the country for a long-standing period of time and for years. And so although this is a big issue to tackle within a very narrow period of time, the task force has done substantial work in identifying some of those key issues. Currently, again, we've been aligned with we've been charged with aligning enforcement activities, working with across those 15 agencies to harmonize regulatory action and develop standards and guidance that will help the mortgage industry and the appraisal industry alike in being able to make sure that there is accurate and equitable appraisals that are being given to borrowers across the country. And as I speak to you today, the task force members continue to coordinate on recommended actions, commitments, and achievements that are necessary to ensure equity and intergenerational wealth transference. As the executive director of PAVE, I couldn't be more proud of the direction that this is going in. Again, a huge issue, but we're looking towards solutions. And with organizations such as this and other industry organizations that we've worked with, some of the key things that we've determined, again, working with academics, think tanks, fair housing and civil rights advocates, NAMMBA and others have been critical in helping us think through how do we get to a more equitable place and a path forward and finding solutions in this. We found that PAVE has served as a catalyst in the recruitment of industry, being good corporate citizens. So we've had meetings with lenders and meetings with the appraisal industry, many of which have submitted proposals to PAVE and to HUD and DPC leadership. And those proposals have looked at supporting the increased need for diversity in the industry. So what we know is that and I'm pretty sure many of you have heard this percentage kind of touted throughout time, but 85 to 90% of the industry is white male dominated. And so part of what this task force is tackling is how do we increase diversity? How do we get people into the appraisal industry? What are some mechanisms in which we can create for historically Black colleges and universities or minority serving institutions? Does it take the number of hours that's being required now to get into becoming an appraiser? Is that necessary? Can we look at it differently? So we're looking for organizations such as this and to have partnerships as we rethink and how we approach the appraisal industry. There are other recommendations on the table to require fair housing training for appraisers. Right now, it's not a requirement. There are some states that have engaged through PAREA in doing some fair housing training, but it's not a requirement across the country. And so we're looking to think through how we can make fair housing training a requirement as a part of the industry. We've also partnered with the appraisal subcommittee and their leadership. Again, one of the foremost fair housing advocacy organizations and law firms are actually evaluating USPAP, the Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practices. And what we believe this to be is it will be transformative work. Again, this is the beginning, big issue, lots of things to tackle. And I know that through the panel discussion today, you're probably going to hear a lot of innovation and opportunities in which I believe will be a learning opportunity for me and the task force to continue to have dialogue and to better understand how we as a whole of government can begin to better address, harmonize, think about legislative initiatives, regulation, guidance that will bring about change and will make the appraisal industry something that will meet people where they are. I find that a number of the people that we encounter, I know we've heard anecdotal accounts, the media, individuals don't know where to go or how to address their situation. So the notion of reconsideration of value is something that's on the table and we're evaluating. So just in closing, I just would like to say this is really the president created a call to action for government, but I also think he extended that call to action to organizations such as this and to our constituent base, right? To make sure that we first help our constituents and people who are borrowers and facing discrimination to get help where they believe that they've been victims of misvaluation or undervaluation. How do they seek help? And so we're looking for agencies such as this to build upon the work that we're doing. We want you to get involved. As I mentioned earlier, next year, we're going to be releasing a final action report, which will include a set of actions and new policy recommendations that the government, agencies, and other participants will take to address undervaluing, misvaluing of properties. We want that report to be fully utilized. We want it to be an active part of panel discussions such as this, and to continue to create think tanks around how we can change this industry to bring about change in the communities that have been disinvested in. And as you can see, based on, I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. Go continue, please.
Okay, I'll close it out. I know I'm giving you guys a lot of information here and talk about PAVE. Again, just really excited about what opportunities PAVE can bring about. And again, we want to make sure that we're connected to organizations such as this and others to provide information and recommendations. If you have any recommendations that you'd like to share with us, you can send information to pave@hud.gov, and we will gladly set up other opportunities to talk and to make sure that you're invited to upcoming listening sessions. So again, thank you for Faith for your leadership, NAMMBA for your leadership in hosting today's event, and looking forward to any future opportunities to build upon this effort.
Melody, thank you. What an honor it is for us to have the leader of this effort on this webinar with us. So we're excited. And I just remember when I first chatted with you, you said, hey, I'm about action. And I loved that, thinking 15 or more agencies getting together, coming out with a plan, and having some kind of roadmap for action, and appreciate your comments. We'll get back to questions afterward, and I encourage those attending the webinar to send in questions as well. Nikitra, we have you next, and I know you have some slides that you'd like to go through. And I want to thank you for being with us, because I know the National Fair Housing Alliance has been thinking about this a long time also, as have you. And I'm looking forward to hearing from your perspective what the consumers are dealing with, but also how you're seeing it from your lens.
Thank you, Faith, and good afternoon. I'm excited to be here today, a part of today's discussion. And I just want to start by just thanking Melody for the leadership that she's providing thus far, and to thank Secretary Fudge and others in the Biden administration for making this an important priority. The National Fair Housing Alliance is a national civil rights organization that was established in 1988 to advance housing justice. NAMMBA is a consortium of nonprofit fair housing organizations, state and local civil rights agencies, and individuals from throughout the United States. NAMMBA has been working for over 30 years to eliminate all forms of housing discrimination and ensure that every community is well-resourced with the opportunities and amenities that people need to thrive. So as Melody said, the question before us is not, whether bias exists, but what we need to do to make sure we can make the appraisal system less discriminatory. My remarks today will focus on bias in the valuation process and fair housing and lending questions raised by it. They will also highlight how the discriminatory bias impacts today's persistent and stubborn racial wealth gaps. And then I'll speak to some of the changes that are needed to create reforms. This is a slide that's speaking to mapping inequality. So for much of our country's history, communities of color were systemically excluded from homeownership opportunities. The New Deal's Homeowners Loan Corporation developed one of the most harmful policy decisions in the housing and financial services markets by creating a system that included race as a fundamental factor in determining the desirability of value of neighborhoods. The system included residential security survey forms that explicitly captured the percentage of Negro populations and other racial living groups in an area, and then utilized that race-based data to grade the neighborhood. The HOLOC's policies and procedures help systematize redlining, as well as the unfounded association between race and risk in the United States housing market. So this map lifts up what that did. And if you can look at how the color gradations are, you'll see that the colors that are in red are graded as the most hazardous, and those were the most least desirable communities. The system also included the creation of appraisal maps that were color coded. And those color codes, as I just mentioned, were done according to color and also according to race and ethnicity. What's interesting is that the maps were not just collected randomly, but they were based on the opinions of leading real estate professionals at the time, including appraisers. Later, the Federal Housing Administration adopted these maps and race-based policies as the basis for mortgage insurance underwriting. So the maps not only reflected the race-conscious views of the nation's housing industry at the time, but were also used to amplify and codify these views throughout the housing system. So we can go to the next slide. And this is a slide of Baltimore, and you'll see how this slide shows that where there are communities of color, those communities are the color red, and they are noted to be hazardous based on Negro concentration. Next slide, please. So appraisal principles and practices perpetuated an unfound association between race and risk. And I want to just focus here on the actual words themselves, because oftentimes when we have this discussion, people are saying, why are you looking back? What is it that you're looking for? And what looking back does for us is it allows us to see the actual policies that were developed for the exclusion that we continue to deal with today. And I won't speak through all of these, but I will highlight the third one, which is from the FHA underwriting manual. And as you see, it notes that neighborhoods are incompatible because of racial and ethnic differences. And this is something that has become a central part of residential segregation in our country. Next slide, please. And what's really challenging from the maps is the reality that this residential segregation has resulted in today's racial homeownership and wealth gaps. As we all know, homeownership is a key to building wealth in our country. And most people don't realize within the first 35 years of the FHA insured program, families of color were only able to receive 2% of those FHA insured mortgage loans. And because of that, white Americans have been advantaged and they've had a head start at building wealth, wealth that is actually grown over time. So we're at a position where today the homeownership gap between Blacks and whites is actually wider than it was before the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and that the racial wealth gaps continue to persist. Next slide, please. And we have examples of individual evidence of this ongoing disparity. These aren't disparities that are just happening yesterday. These are actually challenges for families today. And I'm highlighting this specific example of a Black female homeowner in Indianapolis who was seeking to refinance. Initially, the purchase price was $100,000. The first appraisal came in at $125K. The second came in at $110K. However, after recommendations that the Black photos and the art were removed and that a white friend actually came in and posed as the homeowner, the final appraisal came in at $259K. So there's something substantially wrong with our system. Next slide, please. And these are not just individual instances. We also know that these instances are systemic. And according to data from the Brookings Institution, homes in Black neighborhoods are valued at 23% less, and it averages in a loss of $48,000 per home, with a cumulative loss of $156 billion. So part of the issue with the Black-white wealth gap is that homes in our communities are undervalued. So we're missing critical opportunities to do with homeownership the very thing that our white counterparts are being able to do, which is to use that home equity to really help fund businesses, cover college education, or even retire securely. We're in a system where we're allowing families of color to be set back while white families continue to be able to advance and reap the benefits of homeownership. Black families tend to reach less of that benefit, as well as other families of color. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we need to do is we need to look at the historical data, and we need to figure out how we can come up with solutions that allow us to not manifest in modern times the challenges from yesterday. And we need values and models that don't bake in a history of discrimination. Part of the issue with the appraisal system is that the valuation process is baking in this history of discrimination. So any type of artificial intelligence and automated models, we're going to need to make sure that they are de-biased so that they don't bake in this history and that they create fairness and opportunity. We also have to raise substantial questions about the cost analysis approach. We know that in communities of color, oftentimes these are manipulated in a way that can be harmful for community members. So we need to come up with an approach that doesn't really hurt community members and that complies with our nation's fair housing laws. Our nation's fair housing laws are really broad, and the Fair Housing Act covers appraisals in a very powerful way, and we need to make sure we're using it as a tool to ensure fairness in the process. We also need additional research. We need to be able to answer questions as to what's going on and why are people in communities of color being impacted in the way that they are in comparison to white communities. We also need to make sure that we have diversity within the process. As has been stated already, we know that this is a kind of area of focus that does not have the same broad and rich diversity as the nation. So we have an opportunity to think about apprenticeships and development that look different from the way that the system currently operates. And then finally, we need to ensure increased supervision. We need to make sure our nation's fair lending laws are being fully enforced, and we need regulators to act. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A when I can get into some of the things that FHFA can do to really be a force here. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to Faith.
Oh, thanks, Nikitra. Very insightful and a lot to think about. I think, given what you just shared with us, I'd really love for Alan Hummel to set the stage for all the change going on in the appraisal world. We have this PAVE initiative and appraisal bias that's certainly at top of mind for everyone in valuation right now. But we also have an aging workforce. We have a lot of modernization going on. We have, standards being set differently from our investor environment, the Fannie Mae's, the Freddie Mac, and HUD on what they require in this pandemic, and then beyond that. And so we're kind of dealing with a lot of change right now. And Alan, I'd love for you to kind of set the stage on the current state, where we're going, and maybe talk a little bit about the regulatory schematic on what is the oversight to the appraisal industry, so we better understand that.
Absolutely. And thank you, Faith. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this panel today. Yeah, it's interesting. When I think about how we're progressing in the modernization of real estate appraisals, it takes me back to a book written in 2000 by Malcolm Gladwell, The Tipping Point, that many of us have read. And it's the little things can make a big difference. And with the tipping point being the moment of critical mass, I really believe that's exactly where we're at in our opportunity to modernize the appraisal process and to make certain that the process does not have biases. I believe that's where we're at with the demand for appraisals today, the desire by both the appraisal community and lenders that the appraisal process be more efficient. Technology that was frankly very expensive and somewhat clunky is now more cost effective to implement and reasonably seamless to integrate. We're at a time where the market is demanding a greater transparency as to how the opinion of value is developed and supported. I believe the outcome of this tipping point will allow us to keep professional appraisers involved and centered in the appraisal of real estate within the lending process, that we'll be able to provide efficiencies and transparencies that are beneficial to appraisers, lenders, and borrowers alike. Give you one example is the fact that reconsideration of values, RLVs, have skyrocketed. They're coming from lenders and agents concerned that the opinion is not supported, but also from borrowers that feel that the comparable selection was biased, resulting in unfair valuation. And I really believe the increase in the ROVs is a symptom of a larger problem, the lack of transparency within the appraisal process, within the appraisal reports themselves, which truly allow readers to understand how the opinion was developed. In most mortgage appraisals today, we utilize the industry required forms. The appraiser displays 3 comparable cells utilized in developing their opinion. Now, many appraisers do add additional cells and listing as supporting documentation. On the form, when I speak of the form as the Fannie Mae form, Freddie Mac, VA, FHA, they all use the same form for residential appraising. It does ask questions such as how many comparables were offered for sale in the neighborhood in the last 12 months, and what was the sales price range of those comparable properties that did sell. So there's no lack in transparency as to what the appraiser did consider, but where concerns arise is what sales didn't the appraiser consider? And of those sales used, were they truly from comparable neighborhoods? And this is what we hear in some of these cases where bias has been alleged, and in some cases shown, where the appraiser maybe didn't use what others felt were the best comparables, or they selected sales that provided bias because of those selection of sales, because they went to neighborhoods that maybe weren't comparable to that of the subject neighborhoods. Implementing technology that exists today can provide a greater transparency into the selection of sales and support as to why they were deemed comparable. Today, what you'll see in most reports is a description of the neighborhood, a narrative description of the boundaries, a picture of a map illustrating those boundaries, a grid describing the comparables used, and then they place them on a location map, but showing the subject and the location of the cells used. What's missing is the appraiser's analysis as to why they felt those were proper neighborhood boundaries. And as importantly, what cells in the neighborhood occurred, but not included in the appraisal. So if we look at technology that exists today, we can provide a much greater transparency into the selection of cells and support as to how the neighborhood boundaries were developed and to why the cells selected were deemed comparable. But let's start with defining a neighborhood. With the advancement of geocoding in real property, it's not a difficult task to develop maps that allow an appraiser to show visually what they consider to be the driving factors in defining their neighborhood. Imagine a map that showed the broad global view of the market area, showing municipal boundaries, as well as school district boundaries, property uses and zoning, as well as environmental hazards such as flood zones, major traffic arteries, and where business districts are. Then we can layer on top of that heat map, showing where are the residential properties throughout this defined area, and place the subject property on that map. From there, it'd be easy for an appraiser or any reader of the report to define and understand the subject's neighborhood using objective, critical infrastructure that really defines the neighborhood. Once this neighborhood is critically defined, the appraiser could obviously attempt to find cells that were comparable to the subject property within those boundaries. And on those occasions where there are very few cells similar to the subject, this map, this analysis would serve as further purpose for helping the appraiser identify what are other similar neighborhoods in the market area, and if necessary, defend their use of particular cells outside of an immediate neighborhood, showing that selected cells were in fact in competing neighborhoods, meaning they have locational characteristics similar to the subject. This type of transparency would help answer questions as to why did you use cells in that area, but not this area? Which leads to the next question. Why were these particular cells used? And as importantly, as we spoke earlier, why weren't other cells used? The selection of comparable cells should not be a mystery. In today's existing technology, the appraiser's thought process and their comparable cell selection can be easily documented and illustrated. The process is actually fairly simple. After the appraiser understands the physical characteristics of the subject property, let's say it's a single-family detached home, they then define the driving characteristics that the market looks for in their decision-making process, such as age or bedroom counts, gross living area, garage counts, or whatever the other characteristics or amenities the appraiser determines are driving factors in that market. I want to look at a hypothetical example. An appraiser's research indicates that driving factors in this particular market are age, bedroom bath, GLA, and number of garage stalls. Now, remember the previously mentioned geocoding map that I illustrated. The appraiser is now able to populate that map with icons of all the cells of single-family detached that occurred, let's say in the last 12 months. And I'm going to say that they're represented by blue pin dots. 47 of them are now shown on the map in relation to where the subject is and in relation to what the neighborhood boundaries are. In this report, the appraiser cites the characteristics that they're going to sort the cells by, and they say, listen, in this market, plus or minus 10 years in age, the subject property, between 3 and 4 bedrooms and 2 and 3 baths. That's my criteria for saying what is going to be a comparable property, and they can add more parameters. Once they put these parameters in, the original 47 pin dots, 10 of them that were blue now turn to yellow, indicating they meet the above criteria. So now we're able to understand which and how many of the cells were considered and how the appraiser narrowed them down to their selection of what is comparable. And their selection process is noted in the appraisal report. It's not in their work file, it's in the appraisal report that says, these are the criteria that I used in order to sort the cells, and these are the cells that meet that criteria. And existing technology even allows the appraiser to rank the importance of these characteristics. Maybe square footage is the most important in the market in that area, and then bedroom count, and then the number of garage stalls, et cetera. The appraiser now is able to show a ranking of those cells and they might choose to use the top 3 that meet these criteria. And it's, again, they're shown in the appraisal report how they rank. Or they may indicate that I'm going to use the top 2 because they illustrate the physical characteristics, but I'm also using the 5th ranked one because, like the subject, it also backs to the park. Okay, so able to, again, with transparency, show that I did consider all these cells. This is why I used these. It allows the appraiser to document their thought process in the selection of the cells. It allows the reader to report, to the reader of the report, to understand what cells were considered and why others were not considered. And it illustrates on the map the cells utilized were in fact in the subject's neighborhood of defined characteristics. Or if a cell was located outside the immediate neighborhood, then it was located in a similar neighborhood. And I believe it goes even one step further. It would allow a question to be raised if there were cells that met the identified characteristics of the subject's neighborhood, but the appraiser did not utilize those cells but chose to go elsewhere. Why? Quite frankly, I believe what I described as a process that most appraisers use in developing their analysis of opinion today. What's lacking is the transparency in that development process, which can lead to an apprehension as to the motives of the appraiser, and when there's a disagreement as to the opinion of value of the subject property. The transition that I'm speaking about, would consider the traditional appraisal today to what I've described is not automatic. There's still a fairly complex regulatory schema that needs to be addressed to make certain that the new processes are approved and accepted throughout the whole mortgage cycle chain, meaning that appraisers have to make certain the processes meet the rigor of the Uniform Standards Professional Appraisal Practice, USPAP, and state regulatory requirements. Lenders have to know that these processes will be acceptable to their internal requirements as well as those of investors. And we can't forget, in today's environment, the borrowers must believe that the process delivers a credible and unbiased opinion. And by providing this type of transparency, I believe that it will allow for others than just the appraiser to understand what that thought process was and be able to point out the what, wait, why did you not select or look at these particular cells. My opinion, that Scott's going to be a lot closer to the existing emerging technologies. This is just an illustration of one of the areas that I think that the modernization of appraisals can go a long way in making certain that we have fair and unbiased appraisals, Faith.
Oh, thank you, Alan. That gave us a great grounding, and it would be great to wrap our discussion here up and then open it up for some questions up with Scott, who is mindful of all the appraisal issues and processes, but also pushing and leaning forward on tech and data modernization and transforming this market. And Scott, why don't you tell us a little bit about your efforts and where you think we're going?
Well, thanks, Faith, and thanks everybody for your participation today. I kind of get the benefit, I guess, of going after everybody, and there's just been little pieces from each of you that really stand out to me. And Melody, you mentioned the call to action, and I'm the first to admit, I think sometimes these topics, these conversations are uncomfortable for some of us, and maybe even more so those of us who make up some of the demographics of the majority you mentioned earlier in your presentation. But that call to action is to all of us, and it's here. And Nikitra mentioned as well, the fact that this exists, and my good friend David Batney, I know he's always said, even if one person was affected, that's one that's too many. And it's time for all of us to be focusing less on the debate of whether or not it exists or not, and more on what kind of solutions we can work together as an industry, and what roles do each of us have to play to participate in improving this issue that we're all faced with today. So again, thanks everybody for that. And I also like to hear, it's very validating to hear Melody talk earlier, the things we're focusing on, innovation, enhancing the process and the technology used today, focused on expanding the diversity in the profession itself, and understanding the role each of us need to play in these processes. So starting with enhanced process, we've been working on modernization initiatives for the last several years, and there's a lot of opportunities within that, Faith, as you know. separating the data collection from the process of the appraiser and bifurcating that process, allowing the appraisers to focus on the analysis that Alan was just talking about. And as he mentioned, capturing those physical characteristics using an alternative third-party labor force. And we can leverage that also to bring more diversity into that network of the third parties. And it allows us to not have the appraiser necessarily have to interact with all of the homeowners on every transaction that they participate in, and kind of creating more separation there. And maybe more importantly is what this has done is it's really brought the ability for us to apply technology to this process of capturing those physical characteristics that Alan was talking about. We now can leverage advanced technologies that have been used for self-driving vehicles and other things, leveraging computer vision. We can create virtual tours offering full transparency of that property. We can create detailed floor plans with measurements done to a standard that's repeatable. You could send 5 different people out and you can have the same 5 results every single time, leaving no room for human error or potential biases to exist. We can get the year, make, model match of all the major appliances in the home, spatial context and understanding of attributes that apply to the value of that property, the time and the place in which those characteristics were captured. And maybe most importantly, as I mentioned, it's repeatable, it's standardized, and it's fully transparent. And now we're providing the appraiser, we're presenting the appraiser these physical characteristics, this third-party information to base their opinions off of. And it's now no longer in control of the appraiser to present those physical characteristics themselves. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, through the appraisal process today, all we have are flat file images and some data in a form to understand those physical characteristics. Why shouldn't we be using technologies that apply full virtual tours that give complete transparency of that whole property and ensure no space was missed? Again, bringing those standards for measurement and other applicable aspects of that property. So we believe strongly in leveraging technology in this process, and we think there's a lot of opportunity of separating that role from the appraiser and allowing the appraiser to address and base their opinions off the data that's being provided to them. Next is really expanding the diversity. At CLASS, we're really focused on trying to help with this process. There's several different ways to do it. We're partnering with our friends at McKissick and others to support this. Things like Perea, with our technology that creates these virtual, renditions of the home. We can help support in their proposal to participate in the development of a Perea program with virtual reality and other techniques we can use to really help expand and bolster those programs. Building a staff program where we're bringing trainees also into the profession and focused on diversity within how we're bringing those folks into our profession. And we can leverage these technologies to bring more credibility to allowing these folks to participate in the field without that supervisory supervision that so many lenders have required over the last 10 years, which has caused a big barrier to entry for trainees into our workforce over the last 10 years since the housing crisis. We can create through our staff program a blueprint and the best practices that we can share with our panel appraisers so that they can bring trainees into the profession. And we can have incentives for those panel appraisers who are showing they're bringing diversity into our profession by providing them with more opportunity for volume and for work to come their way. Last is really talking about, our role as an AMC. I think everybody has a role in this process, but focusing on us specifically in our profession, I want to first off applaud many of our peers that are out there that are also helping to lead the way on these initiatives and showing their commitment to the improvement in this process. It starts at home, right, Faith? We're working with Housing Finance Strategies now on setting up training for our executive team, for all of the people within inside of our organization, from top down, improving, our DE&I initiatives, making sure we have the appropriate bias training in place. Again, partnering with our friends at McKissick, they're working on appraisal bias training themselves right now that we can incorporate and help support our panel appraisers as well as our staff in taking these important education, paths to help here. Growing the network of appraisers. We have a big opportunity as appraisal management companies to do this. We have the distribution network, we have the volume of work, we have the partnerships. We have so many great lender partners right now who are saying they want to participate and supporting us as we incentivize our panel appraisers and others to bring trainees into the space in a diverse nature. And again, looking at the processes, I've heard our request, for reconsiderations come up twice now, the ROV process. Alan, Melody both brought that up. The technology helps with these very transparent virtual fingerprints of the property. They can help support that ROV process. Everybody sees the same property, the information that was captured at that time in a fully transparent fashion. So whomever's working through that process, they have this great data set to work with. Additionally, if second looks are necessary, it expedites that process because we can just allow another appraiser to get in there and view the same data, that was captured at that time and not have to go back and revisit the property to get an understanding and perform the appraisal services. So it can really help expedite that process. So again, really focused on what kind of processes we can put in place, our commitment to bringing in that diversity into our profession, and how we can focus as an organization to ensure everybody has the appropriate information and education necessary to participate and to help.
Scott, thanks so much. And that was helpful. We have a little under 10 minutes left, and I do have a few questions for each of you. And I also would encourage anyone who wants to send in a question to please do. And we'll do our best to answer it. Scott, before I leave you, since you gave your overview and you have a great role to help influence the industry and move the dial on this really important topic, so we appreciate that in you. Talk a little bit about the importance of source data, but also authenticated data. That means, we minimize that fraud. You really get certainty in what's being recommended for valuation, but also for investors, lenders, and even the borrower having the best opportunity to have a quality product.
So absolutely. Thanks, Faith. I think thinking of authenticated source data, it's really, again, focusing on allowing the technology to do the work, gathering high fidelity, comprehensive, and unbiased information about that property that it's not left to the human error or potential biases to be influenced. It's captured in a fully transparent fashion. We know exactly the time and place and when it was captured. And it allows for that source data to follow along the transaction for every stakeholder to have the benefit of leveraging and understanding the physical attributes that make up that property. So everyone has an opportunity to really understand completely what that property is comprised of. In our world today, what we get is just a partial view into that property through flat file images and some information that was captured while on site. And this is really about bringing a fully comprehensive view and insight into that property. It's unmanipulable. It's unmanipulable as well, Faith, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. It removes the fraud and makes it a higher quality product. That's true for many of the front end data-driven elements in underwriting as well. Nikita, I know you've talked a little bit about FHFA, and you think there's a role to play for any of the housing agencies, but please share with us what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. Thank you, Faith. FHFA should conduct robust oversight of the enterprise's appraisal activities and monitor for potential fair lending risks, specifically in areas around discretion. We know that oftentimes when discretion is possible, that's where we see many of the challenges. So that's something that we believe that FHFA should really ensure that this discretion is really limited and carefully monitored. We also think that FHFA needs to make sure that the enterprises are using models that don't rely on biased data and are carefully reviewing for the fair lending risks of the data that they are using. We think that, automation promises opportunities, but we also are very concerned that automation and any type of kind of technological process can really have bias built in, and FHFA needs to be very careful and monitor for that. It also needs to make sure that the data used by the enterprises are reviewed for fair lending risks, including data used on historically underserved and undervalued communities. And then it needs to make sure that there's a data collection process utilized that looks for robust fair lending testing as well. And then finally, they should make sure that the research that's being done really looks at the process and its impact on communities of color, and they should release the data in the aggregate form to make sure research can be facilitated regarding communities of color. So those are some key things that FHFA can do, especially because the enterprises are not covered under FHRIA. So anything that FHFA does can have a really transformative impact on the system overall.
Yeah, that's a big reminder about the FHRIA and who's governed by that. I appreciate that, Nikitra. Quick question for Alan Hummel. I just want to make sure I circulate here. Alan, I think we talked a little bit about a hybrid workforce, appraisers doing what they do best with the best information possible being delivered, maybe at a desktop, and someone else would be in the home, entering the neighborhood, an alternative workforce inspector. It could be a trainee, perhaps, who's getting into the business. Tell us the pros and cons of that approach. I know it's being, it's already somewhat underway with pilots thinking through how can we have a different product than the standard appraisal.
Absolutely. And there have been pilots by different organizations, but quite frankly, desktop appraisals have been around, in 1980s, I was doing desktop appraisals. So they themselves are not new. One of the things that we have to make certain as we look through this process, number one, I am an advocate for the process, but I do believe that we need to make certain that those individuals that are doing the property inspections, doing the property data collection, are known individuals, that there be some rules and regulations or standards applied to make certain that they also are held accountable for the data production, that they're ethical in their manners, that they are competent individuals, that they're individuals safe to have in the households. So I'm not certain exactly what those rules and regs and standards would exactly look like, but we hear, as far as I know, this has never, ever, ever occurred. But you'll hear somebody say, "Oh, an Uber driver is going to go do the inspection." I don't think that is the intent, nor do I think there's anybody in a position of authority that would allow something like that to happen. So we need to make certain that they are properly vetted, trusted individuals that do this. And I believe that by doing that, number one, I think it'll open up the doors when we talk about the need for more appraisers and a more diverse. I think it's a great stepping stone, a learning position for individuals to start at that process to really understand the real estate and then evolve themselves through education and mentoring to being able to apply the valuation procedures after that. So I think it's a wonderful initiative that should go forward, again, with proper oversight.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And Melody, we want to give you the last word. Your PAVE efforts are, we're all following it closely. Thank you for being inclusive and letting some of us join in your stakeholder meetings. I would say, I know you have a report that's due in early 2022, maybe February. My question is, isn't this a long-term play? This is going to take a lot of tactical, strategic stakeholder efforts to continue to transform this market. And I'm curious what your big picture thinking is on that.
Sure, and thank you for that, Faith. Just to each of you, I was taking notes, and Nikitra in particular, FHFA is a part of this task force, and so those are great recommendations. And when I listen to you both, or the three of you talk about data, just to respond to your question, Faith, beyond the delivery of the report, the department and the DPC is taking great consideration to how we will continue this work. We know that it's a big agenda. It could have never been done within a 6-month period because it's taken hundreds of years to create the disinvestment in communities. And so I think I can strongly say that the department supports moving this initiative forward and how we can begin to implement some of the strategies that are going to be born as a part of the recommendations and actions over the course of the next year.
Wow. Well, listen, thank you to Scott Rose and Class Valuation, to NAMMBA, and to all of you for really sharing your expertise and helping us understand this very complex issue. And I say onward, and I hope we can all get together again and talk about the progress we're making. Have a great day.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Hey, everyone, I would just like to say thank you for joining, and thanks to our partners again at Class Valuation. Most importantly, thank you to all our panelists for sharing on such an important topic. And just wanted to remind you guys to be on the lookout for the recording of this session on your email, and have a nice day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.